Okay, hello everybody. This is Daniel Korobkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario in Canada for WebYeshiva.org. And we are embarking on something new. Those of you who were with us for our Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim for the past 5 years, I was delighted to be able to take that journey with you. And it certainly was a source of tremendous growth for me personally and very, very enriching. Many of you also may be familiar with my shiurim on Sefer Kuzari by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and those are still ongoing. I give those on Tuesday mornings here at the Bayit, where I'm the rabbi. And those have been going on for a number of years based on the translation that I did for Feldheim Publishers a number of years ago. So what is there left to do in the realm of medieval Jewish philosophy now that we've looked at the guide, we've looked at Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's Kuzari? Well, I think it's time to go backwards in time and see where Jewish philosophy all began. And it starts really with Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who we're going to be discussing today. And his very important work is probably his most impactful work of all of the literature that he composed, which is known as Emunot Videot, the book of faith and knowledge. And it seems that Rabbi Saadia chose that title deliberately for reasons that we're going to discuss today. So usually the way I enjoy teaching is I put up a handout on the screen because it helps me remember what I want to say. A lot of times my mind wanders, and so because of my own feeble way of thinking, I find that having a handout really helps to make things go along more smoothly. So here it is, and I just want to make sure that people know if you'd like to insert a comment or a question, you're more than welcome to, for those of you who are watching using the Web Yeshiva platform. We're also on Facebook Live, so those who are watching on Facebook don't have an opportunity to send a question in live, but you can always send a question in. I encourage you to join the Facebook group, Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim and Emunot Videot. I know it's a long title, but it's everything is free. The Torah here that we study is completely free. You will never be charged a penny for it. Let's get started. The title of our introduction is Rabbi Saadia ben Yosef Al-Fayumi and his Emunot Videot. Al-Fayumi is from the place where he came from. As we'll see, that Rabbi Saadia Gaon was born in the 9th century in Egypt. He's born in the late 9th century, which places him as one of the earliest, it would arguably, or one of the earliest medieval Jewish philosophers. Actually, if you look at, there's a classic book on Jewish medieval philosophy by an author named Husik that was written at the beginning of the 20th century. He has a couple of earlier philosophers. You could argue that Philo was really the earliest Jewish philosopher of the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. But for a number of reasons, we're not counting him because he's not really studying the same kind of philosophy that you and I would think of when we think of medieval philosophy. Rabbi Saadia Gaon was born in Egypt, and he was an outsider because we are looking at the period of the Gaonim. Period of the Gaonim is the post-Talmudic period of the yeshivot that still exist both in Eretz Yisrael and in Bavel. Just as the Talmudic academies had been established during the times of the composition of the Talmud, there was a mass migration that was already starting in the lifetime of Rabbi Saadia Gaon, but it really didn't take off until later in the 10th century and really in the early 11th and century and beyond, where Jews started to empty out of the Middle East and migrated towards Europe. There are many number of reasons for that. A lot of it has to do with new opportunities. They were invited by the rulers in Europe to come and populate their countries and improve their economies. And at the same time, there were religious persecutions against Jews that were starting in the Middle East. So for that reason, we see that the majority of the authors who talk about Machshevet Israel really pick up after Sadia, after that mass migration. But this is while we're still in the land of the Talmud, in Bavel, in Babylon. He became, through his sheer brilliance, because he usually the Gaon, or the head of the academy, was only elected from within, from people who had grown up in Bavel and had been part of the Babylonian Jewish community. He comes from Egypt, so he's quite unique in that respect. He lives during the period of the Gaonim, and let's continue. Sadia is living in an Islamic milieu of Greek philosophy. Those of you who have studied with us both Kuzari and or Moreh Nevuchim understand that Jews of both the Middle East and of Southern Europe, what we would eventually be called Sephardic Jewry, were very much influenced by the Islamic society in which they were living. And Reb Sadia is no exception. He notes that there is a certain methodology of thought which requires a person to use logic and the Greek philosophical method to examine the world around us and to come to certain conclusions about God and about reality. Islamic scholars had done this already now for a couple of centuries since the advent of Islam, out of a desire, curiously enough, out of a desire to supplement their own Quranic texts, which they recognized were lacking. In other words, older religions, such as Judaism and Christianity, had perhaps what we would argue richer internal literature. But Islamic literature was somewhat lacking, and so therefore, while they're developing the Hadith, they're also dabbling in Greek philosophy to help augment and supplement and advance their civilization. While adopting some aspects of Aristotelianism in particular, they rejected others. Certainly that's the milieu in which Rebbe Sadia is growing up. Their method became known as kalam, literally, which means the word, and those who engaged in this study are known as the mutakalimun. We're going to make reference to these titles or these names, and that's the only reason why I mention them. Rebbe Sadia adopted this worldview and this methodology. It's important to note that kalam was not monolithic, and that there were different types of kalamists espousing different theologies, some being more Aristotelian in their thinking, and some being more in line with other ancient Greek philosophers. We will get into more of that as we get further into the Sefer. You might recall from studying Moreh Nevuchim that there were two primary schools of kalamists. One was known as the Mutazalites, and the other one was known as the Asherites. But that's not really relevant for now. We will therefore find Reb Sadia citing different opinions within the Mutakalimun. Later, one of the great opponents of Kalam was the Rambam, who was a staunch Aristotelianism and rejected a lot of the methodologies and the proofs of the Mutakalimun. In the Moreh, at the end of the first section of the guide, he was critical of the Mutakalimun for what he perceived as their errors, which were born out of an attempt to reconcile the Islamic faith with philosophy. In this respect, we find that the Rambam was sometimes critical of some of Reb Sadia Gaon's pronouncements as well, whereas the Rambam had great reverence for Rebbe Sadia, but there are times that he notes that he cannot agree with him because he sides with the Kalam over Aristotle. And so again, we've got Aristotle being adopted only partially by the Mutakalimun, and they adopt other methods and other worldviews about reality. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into the work, and so I don't want this to be too disorienting for people who don't have a grounding in Greek philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy. So some of the main features of Rebbe Sadia's Kalam, and these are things that are going to come out in his work. Number one was his observation of the natural world reveals the existence of a creator. Rebbe Sadia very much believes this, and that's really going to be the opening paragraph that we're going to be studying today, which is going to indicate to us that Reb Sadia's whole objective in writing Emunot Videot was to take a Kalamist view that God endowed us with our five senses, and as such, because we have a benevolent and merciful God, we must conclude that it is through those senses that we have the ability to perceive the reality which God wishes for us to perceive. Number two, the world or the universe must have been created ex nihilo rather than from pre-existing matter. And this is an area of great debate between the Mutakalimun and Aristotelian philosophy. And that's really what the Rambam spent a very large amount of time discussing, because the Rambam was a very strong Aristotelian, and he had to figure out his own way of reconciling Judaism with Aristotle's belief that the universe has eternally existed, going back infinitely in time. There never was a beginning. There never was a creation. There never was a beginning of the clock. All of those things for Aristotle were anathema. He believed in a divine being, which he called the prime mover, but he didn't believe that prime mover was responsible for bringing things into existence, since things have always existed as they are now. And so the Mutakalimun had rejected that aspect of Aristotle and came up with counterproofs to demonstrate that indeed the world was created ex nihilo at some point in time. Now, the Rambam has to do a sort of a dance, whereas he says the Mutakalimun are incorrect in their refutation of Aristotle, but I'm going to show you the real reason why, the real proofs why Aristotle is not acceptable. So he rejects Aristotle, he rejects the Mutakalimun, and comes up with his own arguments as to why the world must have been created from nothing, from God at some point in time. But Reb Sadia very much is in line with the Kalamists of his time. Another point that is featured in Reb Sadia's beliefs is that the Creator is absolutely different from anything in the created world. The Creator is a perfect unity with no division, and human moral criteria and attributes can be applied to God. And this is, again, a very significant point of departure or of difference of opinion between Rabbi Sadia Gaon and Maimonides and the Rambam. Whereas the Rambam believed that God only has negative attributes, meaning you can only say about God what he is not. You cannot say that God is merciful, kind, benevolent, etc. These are only borrowed terms. Rabbi Sadia very much was subscribed to the beliefs of the Islamic thinkers of his time, that God does indeed have intrinsic attributes that in no way detract from his unity. So again, these are fine distinctions that may not make a lot of difference right now in this preliminary area of discussion, but that's sort of by way of introduction. Let's talk a little bit about, before we delve into the philosophical world of Reb Sadia Gaon, for biographical purposes, let's learn a little bit about more who the man was. Other things that Reb Sadia was famous for. He was a big opponent of Karaism, and he got engaged with a very public disputation against one of the founders of Karaism, Anan ben David, head of the Karaites. Karaism really took off in the 9th century during Reb Sadia Gaon's lifetime. Essentially, the argument of Karaism, you've heard of the Karaim. As a matter of fact, in the Shulchan Aruch, it is codified, an entire siman, an entire chapter of the Shulchan Aruch is dedicated to fighting the Karaites. Can anyone tell me how we fight the Karaites halachically in our religious practice? Anyone have an idea? Yes, you have to just unmute yourself if you want to just shout it out.
Hot food on Shabbat morning?
That's right, exactly. The food that we have on Shabbat morning, which we call in our culture, we call it cholent. We have cholent on Shabbos because the Karaites believe that when the Torah says you're not allowed to burn a fire in all of your dwellings on the Sabbath day, they understood that to mean that you cannot have any fire burning, even if it was ignited before Shabbos. And that was, the Karaites were religious fundamentalists, They took Torah shebichtav more literally than the rabbinic tradition, and they did not accept Torah sheba'al peh in the way that it was prescribed by the Talmudic world of Torah sheba'al peh, the oral tradition. They came up with their own oral tradition of kinds, which was developed over the 9th century by their leader and by other people in the Karaite sect. And Reb Saadia Gaon had one of two choices. And this is always the tension and the difficulty in knowing how to correctly combat a religious faction that is unacceptable, that's theologically unacceptable, that poses a threat. On the one hand, you could ignore them and just hope that they go away and disappear. And that was what some rabbinic leaders had advocated, is that the Karaites are a splinter sect. If we don't shine a light on them by combating them, they will eventually fade into obscurity. However, Reb Saadia Gaon took a different approach. He felt very strongly that they had to be combated head on and disputed and demonstrated to be false in their beliefs. And therefore, he wrote some public denouncements of Karaism. And some historians argue that he actually gave more oxygen to the Karaite movement. Well, we'll never know for sure, but in any event, he was a big opponent of Karaism, and we'll see some of that emerge in some of the texts within Emunot V'Deot. Karaites as a sect still exist to this day, but in very, very weakened form. There are very, very few Karaites in the world left today, but it has persisted even into the 21st century. Some of you who have studied the Kuzari may also recall that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who lives over a century after Reb Saadia Gaon passes away. Let me just see. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is born in the 1070s, I believe. Yes, so he's born a full century, over a century after Reb Saadia. But apparently the Karaite movement was quite relevant and was quite alive in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's time. And he also, the third section of the Kuzari, is really dedicated to, again, polemicizing against the Karaites. Rabbi Saadia was also known for translating the Torah, i.e. the Pentateuch and some other select Sifrei Tanakh, into Arabic, which he called the Tafsir, which literally just means a translation in Arabic. And he wrote a biblical commentary on Chamisha Chumshei Torah, which is very readily available in your farm stores. And there is a set of Mikraot Gedolot Chumashim, which contains the commentary of Rabbi Saadia. He wrote a commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, which is known as the Book of Creation. The Sefer Yetzirah is a mystical work. It dates itself back, it proclaims to be dated back to Avraham Avinu, and then was later passed down and received by Rabbi Akiva, who passed it down to his students. But really, we don't know what the origin of this work is, other than the self-pronouncement of the work that it is a very ancient work. And it describes how God created the universe and all of reality using the letters of the Aleph Bet. So it is what we would call proto-Kabbalah. It is, Kabbalah before Kabbalah is a thing, meaning before the Zohar and all the other significant works that on the Zohar are composed. And it was around during the times of Rabbi Saadia. I believe he's the first commentary on Sefer Yetzirah to give it a proper treatment. We also know, and this is another area where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi follows in Rabbi Saadia's footsteps, is that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi devotes a significant portion of the Kuzari to Sefer Yetzirah. And we just recently finished teaching Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's discussion of Sefer Yetzirah in our Kuzari class. And as I pointed out at that time, the reason why Sefer Yetzirah was so attractive to medieval philosophical thinkers is because circulating in that milieu, in that world, was a philosophical offering as to how the world comes into existence. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi definitely believed that you did not need to consult with the philosophers of your time to gain a knowledge of cosmology and cosmogony, of how the universe, how the celestial realm works and its origin. Okay, he felt that Philosophers did not have a reliable tradition. And the only way to really understand what happened so many eons ago is to really consult a tradition that was given to us by God to describe how things came into existence. And he therefore believed that instead of looking at philosophical texts to determine the origins of the universe, you're better off consulting our own local Jewish texts that are local to the Jewish community, because they provide you with a much more meaningful and accurate depiction of how the universe came into being and what the elements are that bring about all of existence. Okay, so apparently Rabbi Sadia feels to a certain degree the same way. We will see perhaps as we go along in our work on our philosophical work, how he also has to have sort of like this dance of encounter with philosophy, but also his very strong belief that tradition is really the final arbiter. The traditions of knowledge that we have passed down to us from our ancestors are the final arbiter of truth, even though we have an obligation to delve into an understanding of the universe using the philosophy of our day. He also wrote a commentary to the Siddur. He wrote a work on Dikduk called Sefer HaEgron. He wrote many liturgical poems and shuvot. He wrote a work called Sefer HaMoadim, which was the source of a big controversy in his time against another rabbi whose name was Ben Meir. Ben Meir had come to a different conclusion during the lifetime of Reb Sadia as to how to calculate the Jewish calendar. And it turned out that according to Ben Meir's calculation and those who followed his teachings, Tisha B'Av and Pesach were 2 days before the real the Yom Kippur, and Pesach were 2 days apart from the calculations that Reb Sadia said we had to follow. So of course you can understand that this was a very, very dangerous time for the Jewish community, because the only way that the Jewish community can remain cohesive is if we have the same calendar. We need certain things to keep us together. We need the same language. We need the same liturgy, more or less. We need the same traditions and practices. And since so many of our traditions and practices revolve around the calendar year, the holidays that we celebrate, we have to be able to have consensus on when these Jewish holidays fall out. And so Ben Meir posed a very, very significant threat to the future of Judaism, and that was something that Reb Sadia fought quite aggressively. He also was the Gaon, like the Rosh Yeshiva of the Sura Yeshiva, starting in the year 928. Due to a dispute with the Reish Galuta. Now, the term Reish Galuta may be very familiar to those of you who are Talmudists. You know, if you study the Gemara, you know that the Jewish community in Bavel had someone who was known as the Reish Galuta. Sometimes that person, he was the exilarch or the head of the Jewish community in Bavel, almost like you could say the president of the Jews living in Bavel. Or sometimes that person himself was very learned. Sometimes he was less learned, but he surrounded himself by learned people. And there was a type of tense relationship between the rabbinic authority, excuse me, of the Reish Galuta versus the Rosh Yeshiva. Almost like, if you can imagine, like a tension in halachic leadership between the chief rabbi versus the Rosh Yeshiva, when you have both a major synagogue and a yeshiva in the same community, sort of who trumps who. Usually it's the Rosh Yeshiva because he's considered more learned. So, but the Rosh Yeshiva has to give deference because the Reish Galuta, the chief rabbi or the chief president, also has political power and can dethrone the Rosh Yeshiva. So because of that, Reb Sadia Gaon was asked to sign off on some kind of ruling that the Reish Galuta David ben Zakkai had issued. He refused to sign off on it. He was removed, therefore, from his post as the Gaon of Sura. And he remained sort of a Gaon in exile, so to speak, still dispensing halachic decisions and his religious authority, and was still very prolific in his writings, while at the same time not the official Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva in Sura. Finally, 7 years later, he reconciled with the Reish Galuta, they made shalom, and he was reinstated. But as you know, that was only for the last 5 years of his life because he passes away in 942. Now, let's just go back a little bit to Emunot V'Deyot. It's known in Arabic, it was, as you know, just from our studies of both the Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's Kuzari, the authors who authored philosophical works during this time and during this, who are part of the Islamic philosophical milieu, write their texts in Judeo-Arabic. So the original title for Emunot V'Deyot is in Arabic. It's Kitav al-Amanat wa al-Itik Hadat, which I have for you written in Arabic as well. It's basically the book of faiths or faith claims and ideas or areas of knowledge that are important for a person to know. I refer you, if you'd like to get a sort of comprehensive summary of all of the topics that Reb Saadia Gaon covers in Emunot V'Deyot. Again, as I mentioned, Husik was a historian of medieval Jewish philosophy. His classic work is A History of Medieval Jewish Philosophy, published in the early 20th century, I think in like 1919 originally. It was republished by Jewish Publication Society in 1944. That's the edition that I have. And if you look at chapter 3, you'll be able to see a full analysis of Reb Saadia's philosophy. And there are many other texts that offer the same thing. There's a lot of scholarship on Reb Saadia. I have a link here on our handout where you can find, you can borrow in this virtual library called archive.org. You can find Husik's work, and it's a good read. Emunot V'Deyot is made up of an introduction and 10 ma'amarim, 10 essays, each broken down by sections. Saadia's philosophy, as I mentioned, is based on the Kalam. The particular stream of Kalam is called the Mutazilite stream of Kalam. He does not subscribe to the Aristotelian model of matter and form, but he doesn't seem to subscribe to the Kalamists' atomic theory either. The argument was between the Kalamists and the Aristotelians, what are the basic building blocks that make up all of that exists? Aristotle felt that it was a combination of matter and form, and the Kalamists believed in atoms, which is more in line with modern scientific thought, but we're not going to go there right now. Altogether, Saadia's knowledge of Aristotelian science was much more limited than the Rambam's, which is not surprising, noting that the life of the Rambam and the life of Saadia are separated by over 2 centuries. And by when we look at the Islamic development of Aristotelian philosophy, we note that the major author of integrating Greek philosophy with Quranic thought, Islamic thought, in the 8th and 9th centuries, when Reb Saadia Gaon is alive, was Muhammad al-Farabi, who the Rambam extolled as like his great Rebbe in philosophy. But the Rambam also had other texts at his disposal. He had Ibn Sina, the great Avicenna, who also wrote a tremendous amount, but Reb Saadia didn't have access to Avicenna, who wasn't yet alive. A contemporary of the Rambam's was Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and he also contributed a lot. So the Rambam is living in a much more robust and rich philosophical milieu than Reb Saadia is, because Reb Saadia is only in the beginning stages of the philosophical world integrating with the Islamic world. And so it's understandable, therefore, if we don't find a more fully developed understanding of Greek philosophy in Reb Saadia's work as we do when compared to the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim. Reb Saadia believed that while the sole basis of correct belief is through our tradition, we are meant nonetheless to demonstrate our tradition logically. And that's one of the issues that Reb Saadia deals with, is like, why did I write this work in the first place? If we have all of our traditions that we need to believe in, We believe that Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, God is absolutely unitary. Why then do we need to discuss this and demonstrate this philosophically, which a large part of the of Emunot V'Dayot is devoted to? And Reb Sadia's explanation is that we have to accept things on faith through our tradition, but that is insufficient for one who has a developed intellect. Very much in line with thinking with the Rambam, but not as committed to philosophy as the Rambam is. The Rambam felt many times that if there was ever a conflict between tradition and Greek philosophy, we had to, in some ways, re-examine the way we understood tradition, and perhaps maybe our understanding of tradition needs to be modified because maybe we didn't get it right. Maybe the tradition that seems to be saying X is really saying Y, and therefore it's reconcilable with modern philosophy. Reb Sadia does not take that kind of very staunch philosophical commitment approach. He instead says the bedrock of Judaism is what we've received from our rabbis and our tradition. No reinterpretation is necessary. When we have the ability to do so because we have sufficiently developed intellects, we have an obligation to look at the philosophy of our times and see how it can inform and enhance our knowledge of our traditions and demonstrate the truths of our traditions. Next, the truth is attainable to any person who possesses human intellect, but it takes great work and effort. And therefore, Reb Sadia will also acknowledge that this is not for everybody. This is not an endeavor that is meant to be pursued by every single Jew. There are people whose minds are not as developed and perhaps will never be developed properly to be able to appreciate a study of philosophy. But nonetheless, for those who have the capacity to do so, it is something that's important for them to do. And he says that a life of observing mitzvot is only enhanced by our efforts to intellectually prove the truths of Judaism. Emunot V'Dayot, as Husik writes, is comprised of primarily two topics: divine unity and other proofs about God, including that he is the creator of everything ex nihilo, from absolute nothingness. And Reb Sadia feels that in order to reconcile God's unity and absolute perfection, we must also prove that God is the creator of all that exists from absolutely nothing. The two go hand in hand. The second major topic that he discusses is justice in this world and man's free will. And obviously, these two topics expand into many, many other topics, and that's why he has 10 chapters to get across what he needs to get across. Now, just a brief word on the texts that we will be using for our study of Emunot V'Dayot. The English translation that we're going to be looking at was composed in 1948 from the Arabic and Hebrew by Professor Samuel Rosenblatt. This is I have an older edition, but the modern edition that you can find on Amazon, let's say, or other booksellers, has this cover: Sajigon, the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, translated from the Arabic and the Hebrew by Samuel Rosenblatt. So those of you who would like to pursue this and pick up the book, I encourage you to do so, and that way you can study this book independently. Now, the other editions that I am using to be able to offer the information about Reb Sadia, I'm using primarily two Hebrew texts. One is, first of all, it's important to know that who translated this work from its original Judeo-Arabic. That was the same person who did so for Rabbi Yehuda Levi's Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibon, who lives really in the lifetime of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi after Reb Sadia Gaon has already passed away. There are many more modern scholars who argue that Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibon was working with an incomplete and fragmented and somewhat maculated edition of Emunot V'Dayot, and therefore it's necessary to supplement the Ibn Tibon translation with a later translation. So what we have done is we have referenced heavily the translation from the Arabic that was done by Rav Yosef Kafich in the 20th century. Rav Kafich was a treasure of knowledge of Judeo-Arabic philosophy for the Jewish world. His contribution was immeasurable to enriching our knowledge of this milieu of Jewish literature. He did a translation of the Guide. He did a translation of Rabbi Yehuda Levi's Kuzari, and he also did a translation of Emunot V'Deyot, among other works that he did. And so the last thing that we want to do is just take a look at an introductory treatise, the very first paragraph of Emunot V'Deyot. When we look at the 10 sections, at the 10 chapters of Emunot V'Deyot, we will notice that they are also broken down into sections. I'm not sure if those were inserted by Rabbi Sadia himself or whether they were inserted by a later editor, but section 1 of the introduction is just one small paragraph, and that's what we'll study together today. The author opened his remarks with the words, "Blessed be God, the God of Israel, who is alone deserving of being regarded as the evident truth. God himself is the source of all that is emet, who verifies with certainty unto rational beings the existence of their souls, by means of which they assess accurately what they perceive with their senses and apprehend correctly the objects of their knowledge." So, unlike modern and postmodern philosophy, which espouses the idea that perhaps our senses are not correctly apprehending reality as it truly is, Rabbi Sadia takes a decidedly Kalamist view that if God is the source of truth and God created us with our senses, then it is absolutely necessary, because of God's perfection and his benevolence, that whatever senses he gave to humanity must be accurate perceivers of truth, so that what we perceive with our senses is indeed the correct way that God wishes us to perceive reality. Now, this has to be qualified, because, for example, when I look at a human being and I perceive that human being with my senses, I cannot necessarily know whether or not they have cancer, for example, right? I can't necessarily know everything about that person by just looking at them and touching them and so forth. So obviously, Rav Sadia acknowledges that the senses that God gave us is not the complete arbiter of truth, but our senses do not deceive us. That is what Rav Sadia wishes to argue. Uncertainties are thereby removed from them and doubts disappear, so that demonstrations become lucid for them and proofs become clear. May he be lauded then above the highest commendation and praise. In other words, Baruch Hashem, thank you, God, for giving me a body, a soul, and the senses that are attached to my soul, that help me have the ability and the intellect that is attached to my soul, that enable me to understand you, God, accurately in the way that you want the world to be understood. We're going to unpack this introductory paragraph when we get into the next section of the introduction next week. The only thing that I'd like to leave you with is that there is one more work on Emunot V'Deyot that I'll be referencing from time to time. It was written about 10 years ago. I'm just holding it up here because I don't have it in the handout. It's called Sefer Emunot V'Deyot L'Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon, with a biur chadash, with a new commentary from Harav Shalom Cohen, who is part of the Dati Le'umi religious community in Eretz Yisrael. It was published by Or Etzion Publishers, so you know that it's coming from from the Gush, and it has a very nice commentary, a modern commentary to help us understand the ideas. I wanted to just because I was so taken by it, even though this is not really germane to Reb Sadia's Torah per se, but there's really a phenomenal introductory letter that appears in this edition of Emunot V'Deyot by Harav Moshe Tzuriel Zatzal, who passed away just over a year ago. He was part of the Chardal Charedi Le'umi community in Eretz Yisrael, lived in Bnei Brak, but was very influential in the Dati Le'umi religious thought world. And he points out, he was a Talmud of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, and by extension, his father, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. And he says something quite fascinating. He quotes Rav Kook in a letter to his students, in which he told his students that there is a fundamental difference between the way Torah is studied in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Yisrael, and the way Torah is studied inside of Eretz Yisrael. Quoting from the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Gemara says that Babylonian Torah study is known as, in scripture, Ba'mechashakim. Ba'mechashakim hoshivani Hashem. God has placed me in darkness, as the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations. And that refers to, according to the Talmud, the method of the way we study Torah. Rav Kook understood that what that means is that the way that people study Torah in Chutz La'aretz is very, very Talmudic based, and a specific kind of Talmudic study, which we would call pilpul. It drills down pilpulistically, I guess if we wanted to anglicize the word. It uses a certain methodology that drills down very deeply into analytic thought and analytic breakdown of every single statement and idea that is presented by the Talmud. And as you know, the curriculum in many of the Litvische yeshivot today is to focus almost exclusively on the Talmud, to the exclusion of so many other disciplines. Rav Kook felt that the Torah of Eretz, and he felt that the reason why Talmud study is designed in that way in the darkness of Bavel is because when you're in a dark room and you are looking for something, you have to try all that much harder to find what you're looking for, and you have to grope around with your hands, and it'll take you much longer to arrive at truth. And even then, you won't know for sure, since it's so dark, whether the thing that you feel that you found, that you've picked up from the floor, is the thing that you're looking for. It feels like it, but you don't know for sure. Eretz Yisrael is known as a place of light, so you can find things much more easily. You don't need to engage in pilpulistic thought in order to be able to arrive at the same truths that you can come to in the Torah study in Bavel, and you can arrive at greater certainty with far less effort. And Rav Kook felt, therefore, that those who are studying Torat Eretz Yisrael are meant to use the additional time that they have in their curricular day towards the efforts of Chochmat HaYirah, studying areas of religious thought that will enhance a person's fear of heaven, his faith, his service and worship of Hashem, to study Musar and Chochmat HaChaim and the wisdom of life. That is the reason why Machshevet Yisrael, that religious thought, studying areas of philosophy that are engaged with the Torah, are much more of an Eretz Yisrael kind of endeavor than the endeavor of Talmudic study that is found in Bavel. So it is much more endemic to Eretz Yisrael than it is to Bavel. For myself, I'm still in Galut, but I am attracted to the Torah study style of Eretz Yisrael. We are using a platform, WebYeshiva, which is based in Eretz Yisrael, and I hope that our study together of Rabbi Saj's Emunot V'Deot will be in line with using that methodology of what Rav Kook calls Torat Eretz Yisrael to be able to enhance ourselves and become closer to God. That's our presentation for today. Are there any? Let me just close the document. If there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them before we break until next week. Any questions or comments from anyone? If not, let me wish you a great week, and take care, everybody.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
All
Really
the
appreciate
best.
it.
Bye.